Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
John, a young man of 26, was free from work, ready to skate and ski in the Alps and celebrate the new year. He occupied the top floor in one of those old, gaunt houses in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his own was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were other lodgers whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. He was catching the morning boat and planned to pack before getting a good night's sleep. As he filled his suitcase with clothes, the snaps broke off and fell to the floor. He had known it was deteriorating, but had expected it to last through one more trip. Now he realized he had made a terrible mistake. It was getting late, and he'd have to rush to make it to the store before it closed for the evening. Only a few blocks away from home was a second-hand shop. John entered, taking in the warmth, and was greeted by the assistant. "I'm looking for a suitcase, the largest one you have." The clerk took him to the back corner, where there was one large suitcase on display, well outside of John's price range. "Is there any room to haggle?" The clerk laughed.
"We close in 5 minutes.
John panicked and looked around the shop, finding nothing in his price range that would do. "Please, sir, I'm leaving on a trip in the morning, and my suitcase just came apart moments ago. Any bag, do you have anything less expensive that I could purchase?" The clerk sighed deeply. "Please, there's nowhere else for me to go tonight. I'd have to delay my trip." The clerk disappeared into the back, where John could hear him shuffling around. After a few moments, he came out with a large brown canvas duffel.
"Just came in. Good bones, but pretty dirty. Wanted to clean it up before putting it out."
"How much?" It was less than half the cost of the suitcase, and the clerk gave an additional discount for the dirt and grime. As John left the store, the clerk turned off the lights behind him.
"Now go, and enjoy your holiday."
John was thrilled. In just 30 hours, he'd be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. The night was cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, sleety rain was driving down the streets before the ice-cold wind followed, howling dismally among the big, gloomy houses, and when he reached his home, he could still hear the whistling wind beyond his windows. He passed his landlady, shielding a candle from the drafts with her thin hand. "I'll be going abroad in the morning for 10 days, Mrs. Monks, if you don't mind collecting my letters." She winked at him.
"Well, I hope you have a happy new year, sir, and better weather than this."
"I hope so, too." He shivered as he ascended the stairs. The sleet volleyed against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee and then set about packing. He liked the packing, as it brought the snowy mountains so vividly before him. For the first time, he took a long look at his recent purchase. The bag was not elaborate in nature. A stout canvas kit bag, sack-shaped, with holes around the neck for a brass bar and padlock. Empty, it was shapeless and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and he was thrilled that he wouldn't have to pack carefully. He shoved his coat, cap, gloves, and skates into the bag, followed by climbing boots, sweaters, snow boots, and earmuffs. On top of these, he added piles of woolen shirts and underwear, followed by thick socks. His suit was next, in case there was a fancy dinner at the hotel, and then he paused for a moment to reflect. It was after 10 o'clock, and a furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him. He thought of the poor people he'd leave behind to spend their new year in such a climate, while he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, dancing with rosy-cheeked girls. That reminded him he must pack his dancing shoes and evening socks. He crossed the room to the cupboard when he heard soft footsteps on the stairs. He paused for a moment, listening. It was Mrs. Monks, he thought, but then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They must have been 2 flights down, he thought, and they belonged to a late lodger. John went back to his bedroom and packed his pumps and dress shirts into the bag. By now, the duffel was 2/3 full and stood upright on its own like a sack of flour. The clerk had mentioned it was dirty, but only now did John see how old and ratty it truly was, faded and worn, obviously subjected to rather rough treatment. As he continued packing, John occasionally thought again about the footsteps down below. From time to time, he was almost certain he heard the soft tread of someone paddling over the floorboards, and they seemed to be getting nearer. For the first time in his life, John felt true creepiness. He had left the room for something, and as he returned, he noticed the top of the bag had lopped over with the extraordinary resemblance of a human face. The canvas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock filled the position of the eyes. A shadow or possible stain, he couldn't tell exactly, looked like tangled hair. I shall be glad of a change of scenery, he thought to himself. In the sitting room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real. This time, he got up and went to see who it could be at so late an hour, but the sound ceased and there was no one on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the vacant rooms. All empty, only shadows. He called over the banisters to Mrs. Monk's, but there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep. Everyone except himself and the owner of these mysterious footsteps. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind after all, although it seemed so very real and close. He went back to his packing. It was getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. With something of a start, John suddenly realized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. Pure nerves, I suppose, he said aloud with a forced laugh. Mountain air will cure all that, he added, still speaking to himself. And that reminds me, my snow glasses. As he passed quickly towards the sitting room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs. It was someone a few steps down from the top. They were in a stooping position, with one hand on the banisters and the face peering up towards the landing. John had found the source of the footsteps. Who in the world could it be, and what did he want? John caught his breath sharply and stood still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs were empty. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes, he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated at the top of the staircase. Then he walked fast, almost ran into the light of the front room. As he passed inside the doorway, he heard someone come up the stairs behind him and go into his bedroom. It was a heavy footstep, but stealthy, the tread of somebody who did not wish to be seen. That was someone on the stairs then, he muttered, his flesh crawling all over. And whoever it was has now gone into my bedroom. His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Finally, he went into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Mrs. Monk's?" The words fell dead against the curtains in a room that held no other figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called. What do you want here?" The curtains swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, his heart felt as if it almost missed a beat. He dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window, streaming with rain, was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but clothes, and there was no one under the bed. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and as he did so, he nearly tripped over the large duffel bag. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bathroom, and he did not remember moving it. What in the world was the matter with everything? A terrific gust of wind tore at the windows, dashing the sleet against the glass. He came to his senses. There's no one here, that's quite clear. Yet even as he said it, he knew perfectly well that he did not believe the words himself. He felt like someone was hiding close, watching him. He went back into the front room, poking the fire into a blaze, and sat down to think. Outwardly, John remained calm, pretending to the very last that everything he witnessed had a natural explanation or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had come up the stairs and gone into the bedroom. He began humming, a bit too loud to be natural, and crossed into his room when he felt every hair on his head stand up. The bag was right in front of him, several feet closer than before, and over the crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly shrinking down and out of sight. He was certain he heard breathing. "Who's there?" He had found his voice, though it was just a whisper. He stepped forward so that he could see all round and over the bag. Of course there was nothing there. Nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, only being 3 parts full, and then he saw for the first time that round the inside, some 6 inches from the top, there ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded blood stain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment, the bag unmistakably lurched towards the door. John collapsed back, searching for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, received his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut with a resounding bang. His left arm hit the light switch and the room went dark. He groped furiously for the knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on it swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so it was several moments before he found the switch. And in those moments of terror, 2 things happened that sent him over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bag shuffling heavily across the floor, and close in front of his face sounded like the heavy breathing of a human being. In his efforts to find the button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, and then he realized he dreaded the return of the light. It might be better for him to stay in the merciful screen of darkness. But he yielded to the original desire, and the room was flooded again with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better to stay in the shelter of darkness. For there, right before him, bending over the half-packed bag, stood a tall, bulging figure, greasy and pale in the merciless glow of the electric light. John felt a disturbing familiarity. Not 3 feet from him, the monster of a man stood, tangled black hair sprawling from his scalp. John attempted to grope the door handle, but the man lifted his devil's face and looked straight at him. "My bag." John finally clawed the door open and fell into a heap on the landing, knocking his head against the floorboards and going unconscious. It was still dark when he opened his eyes, and he realized he was lying stiff and bruised on the cold boards. The memory of what he had seen rushed back into his mind, and he nearly fainted again. Could it all have been a dream? He crawled to the front room as the wintry dawn began to peep at the windows, and covered himself with an overcoat in the armchair and fell asleep for several hours.
"What? You ain't been to bed, sir?"
Mrs. Monks had come up the stairs, making a great clamor. Before he could answer, she continued,
"Well, there's an urgent gentleman here to see you, though it ain't 8 o'clock yet.
"Who is it?"
Says he's an officer."
"Show him up at once, please." John's head was whirling, and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. The officer apologized for the early visit and explained that a terrible mistake had been made.
We don't know how, but the bag disappeared from the courthouse and ended up at the shop that you went to last night. We've been tracking it down, and the shop owner sent us to you.
John didn't understand. Why would the bag have been in the courthouse?
This bag was evidence in the Turk case.
The Turk case. John went cold. In a flash, he realized what it all meant. The monster he had seen had been David Turk, who recently got off for murder due to insanity. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson within the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how Turk stuffed the victim's body into a canvas bag for burial. The ghastly, dismembered fragments forced into this very bag, and the bag produced itself as evidence.
The shop owner was awful upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing this morning with this, as you'll be leaving soon.
The officer pointed to the large suitcase John originally had his eye on, but he couldn't find his voice. Finally, he said, "If you can unpack the bag for me, just empty the things onto the floor." He gestured to the bedroom, and the officer went inside for several minutes. John could hear the shifting and rattle of items being unpacked.
Thank you, sir.
He had returned with the large bag folded over his arm.
Is there anything else I can do?
No, thank you. I'm happy to help in any way. I wanted to see him get put away for a long time. The officer looked back with pained eyes. I guess it was just a nightmare, like some part of myself knew it was his bag. I thought I saw him last night. The officer chuckled, though it felt forced. He hesitated for a moment.
You couldn't have seen him last night. Turk poisoned himself right after release.
John's blood ran cold. Poisoned? What time did he do it?
About 10 o'clock.
John's eyes landed on the old canvas bag.
Most disturbing is, he left a note. Said he wanted the same treatment as the woman he killed. He wanted to be buried in this same bag.
The Duffle Bag, story by Algernon Blackwood, adapted and told by Brian Renaud, featuring Aaron Holland and Shannon Lee Weber.
The child first began to cry in the early afternoon, about 3 o'clock to be exact. I remember the hour because I had been listening with secret relief to the sound of the departing carriage. Those wheels fading into distance down the gravel drive with Mrs. Freen and her daughter Gladys, to whom I was governess, meant for me some hours' welcome rest, and the June day was oppressively hot. Moreover, there was this excitement in the little country household that had told upon us all, but especially upon myself. This excitement, running delicately behind all the events of the morning, was due to some mystery, and the mystery was, of course, kept concealed from the governess. I had exhausted myself with guessing and keeping on the watch, for some deep and unexplained anxiety possessed me, so that I kept thinking of my sister's dictum that I was really much too sensitive to make a good governess, and that I should have done far better as a professional clairvoyant. Mr. Freen, Sr., Uncle Frank, was expected for an unusual visit from town about tea-time. That I knew. I also knew that his visit was concerned somehow with the future welfare of little Jamie, Gladys's 7-year-old brother. More than this, indeed, I never knew, and this missing link makes my story in a fashion incoherent, an important bit of the strange puzzle left out. I only gathered that the visit of Uncle Frank was of a condescending nature, that Jamie was told he must be upon his very best behavior to make a good impression, and that Jamie, who had never seen his uncle, dreaded him horribly already in advance. Then, trailing thinly through the dying crunch of the carriage wheels this sultry afternoon, I heard the curious little wail of the child's crying, with the effect, wholly unaccountable, that every nerve in my body shot its bolt electrically, bringing me to my feet with a tingling of unequivocal alarm. Positively, the water ran into my eyes. I recalled his white distress that morning when told that Uncle Frank was motoring down for tea, and that he was to be very nice indeed to him. It had gone into me like a knife. All through the day, indeed, had run this nightmare quality of terror and vision. "The man with the enormous face?" he had asked in a little voice of awe, and then gone speechless from the room in tears that no amount of soothing management could calm. That was all I saw, and what he meant by the enormous face gave me only a sense of vague presentiment, but it came as anticlimax, somehow, a sudden revelation of the mystery and excitement that pulsed beneath the quiet of the stifling summer day. I feared for him, for of all that commonplace household, I loved Jamie best, though professionally I had nothing to do with him. He was a high-strung, ultra-sensitive child, and it seemed to me that no one understood him, least of all his honest, tender-hearted parents, so that his little wailing voice brought me from my bed to the window in a moment like a call for help. The haze of June lay over that big garden like a blanket. The wonderful flowers, which were Mr. Freen's delight, hung motionless. The lawns, so soft and thick, cushioned all other sounds. Only the limes and huge clumps of guelder roses hummed with bees. Through this muted atmosphere of heat and haze, the sound of the child's crying floated faintly to my ears from a distance. Indeed, I wonder now that I heard it at all, for the next moment I saw him down beyond the garden, standing in his white sailor suit, alone, 200 yards away. He was down by the ugly patch, where nothing grew, the forbidden corner. A faintness then came over me at once, a faintness as of death, when I saw him there, of all places, where he never was allowed to go, and where, moreover, he was usually too terrified to go. To see him standing solitary in that singular spot, above all to hear him crying there, bereft me momentarily of the power to act. Then, before I could recover my composure sufficiently to call him in, Mr. Freen came round the corner from the lower farm with the dogs, and, seeing his son, performed that office for me. In his loud, good-natured, hearty voice he called him, and Jamie turned and ran as though some spell had broken just in time, ran into the open arms of his fond but uncomprehending father, who carried him indoors on his shoulder while asking what all this hubbub was about. And at their heels, the tailless sheepdogs followed, barking loudly and performing what Jamie called their gravel dance. because they plowed up the moist, rolled gravel with their feet. I stepped back swiftly from the window, lest I should be seen. Had I witnessed the saving of the child from fire or drowning, the relief could hardly have been greater. Only Mr. Freen, I felt sure, would not say and do the right thing quite. He would protect the boy from his own vain imaginings, yet not with the explanation that could really heal. They disappeared behind the rose trees, making for the house. I saw no more till later, when Mr. Freen Sr. arrived. To describe the ugly patch as singular is hard to justify, perhaps, yet some such word is what the entire family sought, though never, oh never, used. To Jamie and myself, though equally we never mentioned it, that treeless, flowerless spot was more than singular. It stood at the far end of the magnificent rose garden, a bald, sore place where the black earth showed uglily in winter, almost like a piece of dangerous bog, and in summer baked and cracked with fissures where green lizards shot their fire in passing. In contrast to the rich luxuriance of the whole amazing garden, it was like a glimpse of death amid life, a center of disease that cried for healing lest it spread. But it never did spread. Behind it stood the thick wood of silver birches, and glimmering beyond, the orchard meadow where the lambs played. The gardeners had a very simple explanation of its barrenness, that the water all drained off it owing to the lie of the slopes immediately about it, holding no remnant to keep the soil alive. I cannot say. It was Jamie who felt its spell and haunted it, who spent whole hours there, even while afraid, and for whom it was finally labeled strictly out of bounds because it stimulated his already big imagination, not wisely but too darkly. It was Jamie who buried ogres there and heard it crying in an earthy voice, swore that it shook its surface sometimes while he watched it, and secretly gave it food in the form of birds or mice or rabbits he found dead upon his wanderings. And it was Jamie who put so extraordinarily into words the feeling that the horrid spot had given me from the moment I first saw it. "It's bad, Miss Gould," he told me. "But Jamie, nothing in nature is bad, exactly. Only different from the rest sometimes." "Miss Gould, if you please, then it's empty. It's not fed. It's dying because it can't get the food it wants." And when I stared into the little pale face, where the eyes shone so dark and wonderful, seeking within myself for the right thing to say to him, he added, with an emphasis and conviction that made me suddenly turn cold, "Miss Gould," he always used my name like this in all his sentences, "it's hungry, don't you see? But I know what would make it feel all right." Only the conviction of an earnest child, perhaps, could have made so outrageous a suggestion worth listening to for an instant. But for me, who felt that things an imaginative child believed were important, it came with a vast, disquieting shock of reality. Jamie, in this exaggerated way, had caught at the edge of a shocking fact. A hint of dark, undiscovered truth had leaped into that sensitive imagination. Why there lay horror in the words I cannot say, but I think some power of darkness trooped across the suggestion of that sentence at the end. I know what would make it feel all right. I remember that I shrank from asking explanation. Small groups of other words, veiled fortunately by his silence, gave life to an unspeakable possibility that hitherto had lain at the back of my own consciousness. The way it sprang to life proves, I think, that my mind already contained it. The blood rushed from my heart as I listened. I remember that my knees shook. Jamie's idea had been all along, my own as well. And now, as I lay down on my bed and thought about it all, I understood why the coming of his uncle involved somehow an experience that wrapped terror at its heart. With a sense of nightmare certainty that left me too weak to resist the preposterous idea, too shocked indeed to argue or reason it away, this certainty came with its full black blast of conviction. And the only way I can put it into words, since nightmare horror really is not properly tellable at all, seems this: that there was something missing in that dying patch of garden, something lacking that it ever searched for, something once found and taken that would turn it rich and living as the rest. More, that there was some living person who could do this for it. Mr. Freen, Sr., in a word, Uncle Frank, was this person who, out of his abundant life, could supply the lack, unwittingly. For this connection between the dying, empty patch and the person of this vigorous, wealthy, and successful man had already lodged itself in my subconsciousness before I was aware of it. Clearly, it must have lain there all along, though hidden. Jamie's words, his sudden pallor, his vibrating emotion of fearful anticipation had developed the plate, but it was his weeping alone there in the forbidden corner that had printed it. The photograph shone framed before me in the air. I hid my eyes. But for the redness, the charm of my face goes to pieces unless my eyes are clear, I could have cried. Jamie's words that morning about the enormous face came back upon me like a battering ram. Mr. Freen, Sr., had been so frequently the subject of conversation in the family since I came. I had so often heard him discussed, and had then read so much about him in the papers. His energy, his philanthropy, his success with everything he laid his hand to, that a picture of the man had grown complete within me. I knew him as he was, within, or, as my sister would have said, clairvoyantly. And the only time I saw him, when I took Gladys to a meeting where he was chairman, and later felt his atmosphere and presence while for a moment he patronizingly spoke with her, had justified the portrait I had drawn. The rest, you may say, was a woman's wild imagining. But I think rather it was that kind of divining intuition which women share with children. If souls could be made visible, I would stake my life upon the truth and accuracy of my portrait. For this Mr. Freen was a man who drooped alone, but grew vital in a crowd, because he used their vitality. He was a supreme, unconscious artist in the science of taking the fruits of others' work and living for his own advantage. He vampired, unknowingly no doubt, everyone with whom he came in contact, left them exhausted, tired, listless. Others fed him, so that while in a full room he shone, alone by himself and with no life to draw upon, he languished and declined. In the man's immediate neighborhood, you felt his presence draining you. He took your ideas, your strength, your very words, and later used them for his own benefit and aggrandizement. Not evilly, of course. The man was good enough. But you felt that he was dangerous, owing to the facile way he absorbed into himself all loose vitality that was to be had. His eyes and voice and presence devitalized you. Life, it seemed, not highly organized enough to resist, must shrink from his too near approach and hide away for fear of being appropriated. For fear, that is, of death. Jamie, unknowingly, put in the finishing touch to my unconscious portrait. The man carried about with him some silent, compelling trick of drawing out all your reserves, then swiftly pocketing them. At first, you would be conscious of taut resistance. This would slowly shade off into weariness. The will would become flaccid. Then, you either moved away or yielded, agreed to all he said with a sense of weakness, pressing ever closer upon the edges of collapse. With a male antagonist, it might be different, but even then, the effort of resistance would generate force that he absorbed, and not the other. He never gave out. Some instinct taught him how to protect himself from that. To human beings, I mean, he never gave out. This time, it was a very different matter. He had no more chance than a fly before the wheels of a huge, what Jamie used to call, a traction engine. So this was how I saw him, a great human sponge, crammed and soaked with the life, or proceeds of life, absorbed from others, stolen. My idea of a human vampire was satisfied. He went about carrying these accumulations of the life of others. In this sense, his life was not really his own. For the same reason, I think, it was not so fully under his control as he imagined. And in another hour, this man would be here. I went to the window. My eye wandered to the empty patch, dull black, there amid the rich luxuriance of the garden flowers. It struck me as a hideous bit of emptiness yawning to be filled and nourished. The idea of Jamie playing round its bare edge was loathsome. I watched the big summer clouds above, the stillness of the afternoon, the haze. The silence of the overheated garden was oppressive. I had never felt a day so stifling, motionless. It lay there, waiting. The household, too, was waiting for the coming of Mr. Freen from London in his big motor car. And I shall never forget the sensation of icy shrinking and distress with which I heard the rumble of the car. He had arrived. Tea was already on the lawn beneath the lime trees, and Mrs. Freen and Gladys, back from their drive, were sitting in wicker chairs. Mr. Freen, Jr., was in the hall to meet his brother. But Jamie, as I learned afterwards, had shown such hysterical alarm, offered such bold resistance, that it had been deemed wiser to keep him in his room. Perhaps, after all, his presence might not be necessary. The visit clearly had to do with something on the uglier side of life. Money, settlements, or whatnot. I never knew exactly. Only that his parents were anxious, and that Uncle Frank had to be propitiated. It does not matter. That has nothing to do with the affair. What has to do with it, or I should not be telling the story, is that Mrs. Freen sent for me to come down, in my nice white dress if I didn't mind, and that I was terrified, yet pleased, because it meant that a pretty face would be considered a welcome addition to the visitor's landscape. Also, most odd it was, I felt my presence was somehow inevitable, that in some way it was intended that I should witness what I did witness. And the instant I came upon the lawn, I hesitate to set it down, it sounds so foolish, disconnected, I could have sworn, as my eyes met his, that a kind of sudden darkness came, taking the summer brilliance out of everything, and that it was caused by troops of small black horses that raced about us from his person to attack. After a first momentary approving glance, he took no further notice of me. The tea and talk went smoothly. I helped to pass the plates and cups, filling in pauses with little undertalk to Gladys. Jamie was never mentioned. Outwardly, all seemed well. But inwardly, everything was awful, skirting the edge of things unspeakable, and so charged with danger that I could not keep my voice from trembling when I spoke. I watched his hard, bleak face. I noticed how thin he was, and the curious, oily brightness of his steady eyes. They did not glitter, but they drew you with a sort of soft, creamy shine like Eastern eyes. And everything he said or did announced what I may dare to call the suction of his presence. His nature achieved this result automatically. He dominated us all, yet so gently that until it was accomplished, no one noticed it. Before 5 minutes had passed, however, I was aware of one thing only. My mind focused exclusively upon it, and so vividly that I marveled the others did not scream or run or do something violent to prevent it. And it was this: that, separated merely by some dozen yards or so, this man, vibrating with the acquired vitality of others, stood within easy reach of that spot of yawning emptiness, waiting and eager to be filled. Earth scented her prey. These two active centers were within fighting distance. He, so thin, so hard, so keen, yet really spreading large with the loose surround of others' life he had appropriated, so practiced and triumphant. That other, so patient, deep, with so mighty a draw of the whole earth behind it, and so obviously aware that its opportunity at last had come. I saw it all as plainly as though I watched two great animals prepare for battle, both unconsciously. Yet in some inexplicable way I saw it, of course, within me, and not externally. The conflict would be hideously unequal. Each side had already sent out emissaries. How long before I could not tell, for the first evidence he gave that something was going wrong with him was when his voice grew suddenly confused. He missed his words, and his lips trembled a moment and turned flabby. The next second, his face betrayed that singular and horrid change, growing somehow loose about the bones of the cheek and larger, so that I remembered Jamie's miserable phrase. The emissaries of the two kingdoms, the human and the vegetable, had met, I make it out, in that very second. For the first time in his long career of battening on others, Mr. Freen found himself pitted against a vaster kingdom than he knew, and, so finding, shook inwardly in that little part that was his definite, actual self. He felt the huge disaster coming. "Yes, John," he was saying in his drawling, self-congratulating voice. "Sir George gave me that car. Gave it to me as a present. Wasn't it And then broke off abruptly, stammered, drew breath, stood up, and looked uneasily about him. For a second, there was a gaping pause. It was like the click which starts some huge machinery moving, that instant's pause before it actually starts. The whole thing, indeed, then went with the rapidity of machinery running down and beyond control. I thought of a giant dynamo working silently and invisible. "What's that?" he cried in a soft voice charged with alarm. "What's that horrid place? And someone's crying there. Who is it?" He pointed to the empty patch. Then, before anyone could answer, he started across the lawn towards it, going every minute faster. Before anyone could move, he stood upon the edge. He leaned over, peering down into it. It seemed a few hours passed, but really they were seconds, for time is measured by the quality and not the quantity of sensations it contains. I saw it all with merciless, photographic detail, sharply etched amid the general confusion. Each side was intensely active, but only one side, the human, exerted all its force in resistance. The other merely stretched out a feeler, as it were, from its vast potential strength. No more was necessary. It was such a soft and easy victory. Oh, it was rather pitiful. There was no bluster or great effort, on one side at least. Close by his side, I witnessed it, for I, it seemed, alone had moved and followed him. No one else stirred, though Mrs. Freen clattered noisily with the cups, making some sudden impulsive gesture with her hands. And Gladys, I remember, gave a cry. It was like a little scream. "Oh, Mother, it's the heat, isn't it?" Mr. Freen, her father, was speechless, pale as ashes. But the instant I reached his side, it became clear what had drawn me there thus instinctively. Upon the other side, among the silver birches, stood little Jamie. He was watching. I experienced, for him, one of those moments that shake the heart. A liquid fear ran all over me, the more effective because unintelligible, really. Yet I felt that if I could know all and what lay actually behind, my fear would be more than justified. That the thing was awful, full of awe. And then it happened. A truly wicked sight, like watching a universe in action, yet all contained within a small square foot of space. I think he understood vaguely that if someone could only take his place, he might be saved. And that was why, discerning instinctively the easiest substitute within reach, he saw the child and called aloud to him across the empty patch, "James, my boy, come here." His voice was like a thin report, but somehow flat and lifeless, as when a rifle misses fire, sharp yet weak. It had no crack in it. It was really supplication. And with amazement I heard my own ring out, imperious and strong, though I was not conscious of saying it. "Jamie, don't move. Stay where you are." But Jamie, the little child, obeyed neither of us. Moving up nearer to the edge, he stood there, laughing. I heard that laughter, but could have sworn it did not come from him. The empty, yawning patch gave out that sound. Mr. Freen turned sideways, throwing up his arms. I saw his hard, bleak face grow somehow wider, spread through the air and downwards. A similar thing I saw was happening at the same time to his entire person, for it drew out into the atmosphere in a stream of movement. The face for a second made me think of those toys of green India rubber that children pull. It grew enormous. But this was an external impression only. What actually happened, I clearly understood, was that all this vitality and life he had transferred from others to himself for years was now in turn being taken from him and transferred elsewhere. One moment on the edge he wobbled horribly, then with that queer sideways motion, rapid yet ungainly, he stepped forward into the middle of the patch and fell heavily upon his face. His eyes, as he dropped, faded shockingly, and across the countenance was written plainly what I can only call an expression of destruction. He looked utterly destroyed. I caught a sound from Jamie, but this time not of laughter. It was like a gulp. It was deep and muffled, and it dipped away into the earth. Again, I thought of a troop of small black horses galloping away down a subterranean passage beneath my feet, plunging into the depths, their tramping growing fainter and fainter into buried distance. In my nostrils was a pungent smell of earth. And then all passed. I came back into myself. Mr. Freen, Jr., was lifting his brother's head from the lawn where he had fallen from the heat, close beside the tea table. He had never really moved from there. And Jamie, I learned afterwards, had been the whole time asleep upon his bed upstairs, worn out with his crying and unreasoning alarm. Gladys came running out with cold water, sponge and towel, brandy too, all kinds of things.
"Mother, it was the heat, wasn't it?"
I heard her whisper, but I did not catch Mrs. Freen's reply. From her face it struck me that she was bordering on collapse herself. Then the butler followed, and they just picked him up and carried him into the house. He recovered even before the doctor came. But the queer thing to me is that I was convinced the others all had seen what I saw, only that no one said a word about it. And to this day, no one has said a word. And that was, perhaps, the most horrid part of all. From that day to this, I have scarcely heard a mention of Mr. Freen, Sr. It seemed as if he dropped suddenly out of life. The papers never mentioned him. His activities ceased, as it were. His afterlife, at any rate, became singularly ineffective. Certainly he achieved nothing worth public mention. But it may be only that, having left the employ of Mrs. Freen, there was no particular occasion for me to hear anything. The afterlife of that empty patch of garden, however, was quite otherwise. Nothing, so far as I know, was done to it by gardeners, or in the way of draining it, or bringing in new earth. But even before I left in the following summer, it had changed. It lay untouched, full of great, luscious, driving weeds and creepers, very strong, full-fed, and bursting thick with life.
John Mudbury was on his way home from the shops, his arms full of Christmas presents. It was after 6 o'clock, and the streets were very crowded. He was an ordinary man, lived in an ordinary suburban flat, with an ordinary wife and ordinary children. He did not think them ordinary, but everybody else did. He had ordinary presents for each one: a cheap blotter for his wife, a cheap air gun for the boy, and so forth. He was over 50, bald, in an office, decent in mind and habits, of uncertain opinions, uncertain politics, and uncertain religion. Yet he considered himself a decided, positive gentleman, quite unaware that the morning newspaper determined his opinions for the day. He just lived, from day to day. Physically, he was fit enough, except for a weak heart, which never troubled him. And his summer holiday was bad golf, while the children bathed, and his wife read Garvice on the sands. Like the majority of men, he dreamed idly of the past, muddled away the present, and guessed vaguely, after imaginative reading on occasion, at the future. "I'd like to survive all right," he said, "provided it's better than this," surveying his wife and children, and thinking of his daily toil. Otherwise, and he shrugged his shoulders, as a brave man should. He went to church regularly, but nothing in church convinced him that he did survive, just as nothing in church enticed him into hoping that he would. On the other hand, nothing in life persuaded him that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't. "I am an evolutionist," he loved to say to thoughtful cronies over a glass, having never heard that Darwinism had been questioned. And so he came home gaily, happily, with his bunch of Christmas presents for the wife and little ones, stroking himself upon their keen enjoyment and excitement. The night before, he had taken the wife to see magic at a select London theatre, where the intellectuals went, and had been extraordinarily stirred. He had gone questioningly, yet expected something out of the common. "It's not musical," he warned her, "nor farce, nor comedy, so to speak." And in answer to her question as to what the critics had said, he had wriggled, sighed, and put his gaudy necktie straight 4 times in quick succession. For no man in the street with any claim to self-respect could be expected to understand what the critics had said, even if he understood the play. And John had answered truthfully, "Oh, they just said things. But the theatre's always full, and that's the only test." And just now, as he crossed the crowded circus to catch his bus, it chanced that his mind, having glimpsed an advertisement, was full of this particular play, or rather of the effect it had produced upon him at the time. He saw a monster glaring at him with eyes of blazing fire. It was horrible. It rushed upon him. He dodged. Another monster met him round the corner. He dodged again, a leap that might have cleared a hurdle easily, but was too late. Between the pair of them, his heart literally in his gullet, he was mercilessly caught. Bones crunched. There was a soft sensation, icy cold and hot as fire. Horns and voices roared, battering rams he saw, and a carapace of iron. Then dazzling light, and by some extraordinary luck escaped miraculously onto the opposite pavement. There was no doubt about it. By the skin of his teeth he had dodged a rather ugly death. First, he felt for his presents. All was safe. And then, instead of congratulating himself and taking breath, he hurried homewards, on foot, which proved that his mind had lost control a bit, thinking only how disappointed the wife and children would have been if anything had happened. Another thing he realized, oddly enough, was that he no longer really loved his wife, but had only great affection for her. What made him think of that, heaven only knows, but he did think of it. He was an honest man without pretense. This came as a discovery somehow. He turned a moment and saw the crowd gathered about the entangled taxicabs, policemen's helmets gleaming in the lights of the shop windows, then hurried on again, his thoughts full of the joy his presence would give, of the scampering children, and of his wife, bless her silly heart, eyeing the mysterious parcels. And though he could never explain how, he presently stood at the door of the jail-like building that contained his flat, having walked the whole 3 miles. His thoughts had been so busy and absorbed that he had hardly noticed the length of a weary trudge. Besides, he reflected, thinking of the narrow escape, I've had a nasty shock. It was a damned near thing, now I come to think of it. He still felt a bit shaky and bewildered, yet at the same time he felt extraordinarily jolly and light-hearted. He counted his Christmas parcels, hugged himself in anticipatory joy, and let himself in swiftly with his latchkey. I'm late, he realized, but when she sees the brown paper parcels, she'll forget to say a word. God bless the old faithful soul. And he softly used the key a second time and entered his flat on tiptoe. In his mind was the master impulse of that afternoon, the pleasure these Christmas presents would give his wife and children. He heard a noise. He hung up hat and coat in the poky vestibule. They never called it hall, and moved softly towards the parlor door, holding the packages behind him. Only of them, he thought, not of himself. Of his family, that is, not of the packages. Pushing the door cunningly ajar, he peeped in shyly. To his amazement, the room was full of people. He withdrew quickly, wondering what it meant. A party? And without his knowing about it? Extraordinary. Keen disappointment came over him. But as he stepped back, the vestibule he saw was full of people too. He was uncommonly surprised, yet somehow not surprised at all. People were congratulating him. There was a perfect mob of them. Moreover, he knew them all, vaguely remembered them at least, and they all knew him. Isn't it a game? Laughed someone, patting him on the back. They haven't the least idea. And the speaker. It was old John Palmer, the bookkeeper at the office, emphasized the they. Not the least idea, he answered with a smile, saying something he didn't understand, yet knew was right. His face apparently showed the utter bewilderment he felt. The shock of the collision had been greater than he realized evidently. His mind was wandering. Possibly. Only the odd thing was, he had never felt so clear-headed in his life. 10,000 things grew simple suddenly. But how thickly these people pressed about him, and how familiarly. "My parcels," he said, joyously pushing his way across the throng. "These are Christmas presents I bought for them." He nodded toward the room. "I've saved for weeks, stopped cigars and billiards and several other good things to buy them." "Good man," said Palmer with a happy laugh. "It's the heart that counts." Mudbury looked at him. Palmer had said an amazing truth. Only, people would hardly understand and believe him, would they? "Eh?" he asked, feeling stuffed and stupid, muddied somewhere between two meanings, one of which was gorgeous and the other stupid beyond belief. "If you please, Mr. Mudbury, step inside. They are expecting you," said a kindly, pompous voice, and turning sharply he met the gentle, foolish eyes of Sir James Epiphany, director of the bank where he worked. The effect of the voice was instantaneous from long habit. "They are." He smiled from his heart and advanced as from the custom of many years. Oh, how happy and gay he felt! His affection for his wife was real. Romance indeed had gone, but he needed her, and she needed him. And the children, Millie, Bill, and Jean, he deeply loved them. Life was worth living indeed. In the room was a crowd, but an astounding silence. John Mudbury looked round him. He advanced towards his wife, who sat in the corner armchair with Millie on her knee. A lot of people talked and moved about. Momentarily the crowd increased. He stood in front of them, in front of Millie and his wife, and he spoke, holding out his packages. "It's Christmas Eve," he whispered shyly, "and I've brought you something for everybody. Look." He held the packages before their eyes. Of course," said a voice behind him. "But you may hold them out like that for a century. They'll never see them." "Of course they won't. But I love to do the old sweet thing," replied John Mudbury, then wondered with a gasp of stark amazement why he said it. "I think," whispered Millie, staring around her. "Well, what do you think?" her mother asked sharply. "You're always thinking something queer." "I think," the girl continued dreamily, "that Daddy's already here." She paused, then added with a child's impossible conviction, "I'm sure he is. I feel him." There was an extraordinary laugh. Sir James Epiphany laughed. The others, the whole crowd of them, also turned their heads and smiled. But the mother, thrusting the child away from her, rose up suddenly with a violent start. Her face had turned to chalk. She stretched her arms out into the air before her. She gasped and shivered. There was anguish in her eyes. "Look," repeated John, "these are the presents that I brought." But his voice apparently was soundless, and with a spasm of icy pain he remembered that Palmer and Sir James some years ago had died. "It's magic," he cried. "But I love you, Ginny. I love you, and I have always been true to you, as true as steel. We need each other. Oh, can't you see? We go on together, you and I, forever and ever." "Think," interrupted an exquisitely tender voice. "Don't shout. They can't hear you now." And turning, John Mudbury met the eyes of Everard Minturn, their president of the year before. Minturn had gone down with the Titanic. He dropped his parcels then. His heart gave an enormous leap of joy. He saw her face, the face of his wife, look through him. But the child gazed straight into his eyes. She saw him. The next thing he knew was that he heard something tinkling, far, far away. It sounded miles below him. Inside him, he was sounding himself, all utterly bewildering. Like a bell. It was a bell. Millie stooped down and picked the parcels up. Her face shone with happiness and laughter. But a man came in soon after. A man with a ridiculous, solemn face, a pencil and a notebook. He wore a dark blue helmet. Behind him came a string of other men. They carried something. Something. He could not see exactly what it was. But when he pressed forward through the laughing throng to gaze upon it, he dimly made out 2 eyes, a nose, a chin, a deep red smear, and a pair of folded hands upon an overcoat. A woman's form fell down upon them then, and he heard the soft sounds of children weeping strangely, and other sounds, as of familiar voices laughing gaily. They'll join us presently. It goes like a flash. And turning with great happiness in his heart, he saw that Sir James had said it, holding Palmer by the arm as with some natural yet unexpected love of sympathetic friendship. "Come on," said Palmer, smiling like a man who accepts a gift in universal friendship. "Let's help him. They'll never understand. Still, we can always try." The entire throng moved up with laughter and amusement. It was a moment of hearty, genuine life at last. Delight and joy and peace were everywhere. Then John Mudbury realized the truth, that he was dead.